Good morning. I have a new pattern and a new project to try out for the very first time. This is our pattern for the day. That's the one I want. So, if I can get it to focus, there. So that's the one I want. What I'm going to be using is the same type of fabric that I made out of the that Simplicity dress, the navy blue linen, but I had some in a lighter blue too. And it is pre-washed. I serged the edge, ran it through the washer and dryer so it would shrink up and get nice and soft, because that linen comes with this starch on it that I just am not a fan of. And I don't plan on dry cleaning or anything like that, my linen garments. So I treat my fabric the way I will treat my finished garments, which is washer and dryer. So anyway, this is the project. I'm going to go ahead and get started cutting out the pieces. You know how to do that. Don't need to walk you through it. And we'll take it from here. Okay, take that back, because I just realized something fabulous about this pattern. Look, it has where you can cut your front pieces based on your cup size, which is great, because like for me, my girth around my rib cage, chest and everything is a lot smaller than my actual bust measurement. So it's not that I'm like super chunky. I'm chunky but not super chunky, but I have a large bust. So by doing it this way, they customize the front pieces, because they are kind of a princess seam type piece. Oh, focus for me. Because they are like a princess seam type of a piece. And so that way it's going to lay smoother. So I'm really excited about that. That's a plus right off the bat. While I'm cutting this out, it seems like there's a great debate in the sewing community on should you cut out your pattern pieces or trace them, especially on these tissue papery things. Here's my thoughts. 99% of the time I'm sewing for myself if it's a pattern I pick out for myself. Obviously, if it's a children's pattern, it's not for myself. Okay, but I don't think at this stage in my life that my body is going to shift that dramatically, that I'm going to need to preserve every single size of a pattern piece of a pattern that I want for myself personally. And tracing it out just gives another chance to mess up the proportions, because you never trace it perfectly. It's just, you just don't. You trace slightly outside the line or something like that. It's never exactly right, as it is when you cut out around the pattern. It's not exactly right, but it takes that dimension one down of getting things screwed up size-wise. And I just don't have time for it. There's other things I'd rather be doing in my craft room than tracing out a pattern, and it just seems kind of redundant to me. So people will argue, people will do whatever they want to. That's my philosophy, and that's why I'm cutting out my pattern. Okay, so my first impression is, wow, this pattern has a lot of pieces, but you know, we can deal with it. As I do, I'm going to try to rip this linen. It's usually harder to rip than cotton, to make sure I start on a straight, because the cut edges are not always perfect. So I rip it to make sure I'm all on one straight, and then I'm going to iron this part that I ripped down. I just want to make sure that I get it nice and flat all the way across. Just wanted to give you a heads up. The very first thing that's a little bit odd is they want you to fold your fabric with the selvages in the middle, so you have two folded edges to cut out your main center pieces. So, in case it's a little bit confusing on their tiny diagram, that's what they're doing. I also wanted to mention that there's these two pieces that look like facing pieces, a back and a front. Instead of just the one back and two fronts that you would normally do, this is a band and not a facing. And so you're actually going to need to cut 2 of the backs and 4 of the fronts because that way it's a complete band. So still cutting out here, but I wanted to show you a thing. So here are scissors, all right? And I just learned this a little while ago. Cutting it this way, you can do it, but it puts pressure in the wrong spot. This little slot right here was made for this finger. Yes, it was. So that way you can guide it better. And these fingers aren't under enough the same amount of pressure, which is fabulous. So I was amazed, learned something new every day. But my goodness, if it doesn't work, it's amazing. So anyway, finger slot right there. So there's a lot to mark and a lot to do on this pattern. There's so many pieces. So the first thing we're going to do is your piece number 1, and depending on your cup size, it could be pattern piece 1, 2, or 3. I'm using 3, and I am going to be doing all my marks as usual. I am using my little thingy here to cut out my circles, and I am using my erasable and iron pen to mark. We're going to have a dart, a shoulder circle, this little front circle that we're going to have to reinforce, several notches. So just one thing at a time. I'm going to go ahead and cut out my dart circles and get those marked now. When I'm marking my darts, you also have to cut these. These aren't marked, but it's the second dot is for my size, so the second dot and the second dot. It's kind of self-explanatory. And I also put a little line at the bottom of that line, so that I can see where that's going to go. As I've said before, I clip my notches just slightly in, not all the way to the point, but almost enough that I can see them, but not enough that everyone else is going to see them. Okay, so stay tape is done. I am marking the first dart. What I do is I stick a little pin in the very tip from dot to dot all the way across. Bring those so they're nice and flat. And then, okay, so I leave the pin in where it went in and then push it up. All right, that way I know that the first mark where the pin is in is where I'm supposed to be aiming at with my stitches. And then the very top one is like a sideways one. So then I do go ahead and draw it out. Let me find a ruler here. Pandemonium. Okay, so I do draw it out also because it's more of a belt and suspenders kind of thing. So that way I have a line to follow. This does disappear, so that's no problem. I can mark up to my heart's desire. So the next thing it wants you to do is stay stitch between the 2 notches where your bust dart is. Again, because of me, I'm going to stay tape it instead, but if you were to stitch it's between those 2 notches. Apparently, I just did that thing where you think you're recording, but you're not. And then when you think you're not recording, and you're just kind of clearing your throat and moving stuff around, that's when you are. So things happen. But anyway, we are down to working on the back piece. That front and side front is done. It's over on the dress form. I'm working on the back, and again, what they're going to want you to do is stay stitch. There's a lot of stay stitching in this pattern, but like everything, I am going to stay tape. And they want you to do it from the waist. So waistline is about half an inch underneath this part. So I'm going to mark it here. They want you to put your stay stitch, my stay tape, from the waistline all the way up. And I'm going to do that on both sides. And then after I do that, I'm going to serge the whole piece. Okay, so I got this done. There's my my tape and it's serged. So the next thing is to get the, why did I grab that? This is sleeve back. There are so many pieces to this outfit, I tell you. Okay, this is side back. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and make my notches, make my circles, and serge around this thing, and we're going to pin it together. You're going to have to make a few notches on your side back just so it'll lay flat when you stitch it on here. Not a big deal, but that's our next step. So I'm pinning my center back to my side back, and I'm not going to lie, this is one thing that's kind of a pain. There is a lot of just a little bit of ease, a little bit of everything, a little bit of clip, a little bit of fudging to make it fit on this pattern so far, which is not a really big deal, but it's something that you can't just slap it together and sew because you need to kind of pay attention to how it's all laying. So just wanted to throw that out there. It's not necessarily a negative. It's a, you know what, this is kind of bumping it up into a more of a intermediate rather than a beginner type of a pattern. You know what I mean? So, okay, so hopefully you can see what I'm doing is I am putting the side back on the bottom, the center back is on the top, and I have it just on a number 3 stitch, probably a little less than a number 3, but this part it's fine. I'm up here, I'm getting into where I need to ease. So what I'm going to do is where I have it pinned, just kind of make sure I have it straight, hold it a little bit tighter than normal so it really has to grab it and pull it. What that does is it eases in the bottom layer a little bit at a time so you don't have any puckers and it's nice and even, but it fits that extra in there. So I'm just kind of putting a little extra tension on there, making sure my edge comes upright. So when I pull it out, see how it's a little bit ruffly on this side? That's because that was gathered in or eased in. But on this side, on the seam, you don't see any of that because the machine did it itself, a tiny, tiny fragment at a time. So that is my easing in tip of the day. With that done, I'm going to go ahead and press these back side seams open. Nicely, so that from this side we get a really nice edge. Nice and smooth. Okay, so that part is done. Going to start working on the yoke. This pattern piece is printed incredibly light, but I think I can still read it. So basically we have 2 of these that were cut on the fold for the back and 2 that were cut separately for the front. I'm going to go ahead and sew the fronts to the backs right now at the same time so that I have everything in one spot. So it looks like I can match up with my notches. Here to here. This just does not feel right for some reason, but I guess it is. It's kind of at a funky angle, you see what I mean? So this is how it is. So these pieces are like set at an angle, and this overshoots, but that way it matches up at the 5/8 inch mark. So I'm going to assume that that is right, that they know what they are doing. So here is my back piece. I have my yoke, the back and the two fronts sewed onto this yoke. There's two of these. And I'm going to go ahead and pin and stitch this onto my back. Again, a little bit of easing to do, but at this point it's to be expected, right? I take that back. What they wanted you to do is just baste it and then come back and do the other side. I don't think that's necessary for me. I am just going to go ahead and do both sides at the same time. Got a little thread here. So, both sides having the right sides towards the back. All right. I'm pinning it so you have a sandwich of 3 layers of fabric. So you have an exposed seam allowance on your yoke here, an exposed seam allowance on your yoke here, and then the back piece in the middle. All right, so I have it sewed on and pressed up. So this is the inside, and this is nicely pressed up here, nicely pressed up here on the outside. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew the front pieces on. So taking just the outside one, flipping the inside one down, and then I'm going to take my front piece face down and put it on top. So this up here, my front piece tops are going to be pinned on here. All right, so the front pieces are sewn on here, and you can see I have this seam allowance pressed up. Now I'm going to be matching this little yoke piece at the shoulder seams with a pin, both sides. That way I can make sure it's staying where it's supposed to stay. And then down here, I'm going to be turning it and pinning it down so that I can just barely on the inside of the stitching line. I want to see the stitches though. This is how I do it. I do it so I can see the stitches so that when I go back and whip stitch it or stitch it by machine, I can 100% guarantee that either my stitches will be invisible or that if I'm machine stitching it, that they are going to be running exactly parallel to the stitching line that I attached it with so that it'll look nice and neat. So I went ahead and just top stitched it with my sewing machine. I think that looks fine. And I also did a little bit of stitch in the ditch here and here at the very top shoulder seam, just like the last 3/8 of an inch in. It's not going to be showing because once we sew the band and the sleeve on, but that way it keeps it secure. So like you can see here, this is where the sleeve is going to go. Well, maybe you can see better. I need to serge this part here just because the bottom part and the top part are already done. And I'm also going to go ahead, it's not necessary, but I'm going to go ahead and serge around the whole neckline back just so it's only a single layer that I'm messing with when I'm putting that band in. I just feel more secure that way. So I need to cut out interfacing for my band pieces. And I wanted to show you something else. If you are using a Pellon type fusible interfacing that's just a bonded interfacing, it doesn't have to be placed on the grain because there is no grain. It's just a whole bunch of fibers all just kind of welded together. So even though this has a grain line going this way, it's fine for me to put it on however I want to, honestly, because there is no grain. It's all just very wiggly woggly, timey-wimey, as someone important once said. So I know I've shown this before, but I'm going to go ahead and show it again. This is the way that I put on my fusible interfacing. First, I don't mark my pattern pieces at all until after my interfacing is applied. So the first thing I do is iron my fabric. So it's super, super flat and ready to go, okay? Then I take the bumpy fusible side, make sure you put that down, and I adjust my fabric to fit the interfacing because fabric moves and the interfacing doesn't. So see how just by ironing it, I already have my fabric poking out almost a 1/4 inch here, and that's just because it wasn't 100% ironed out before. That's fine. I'm going to trim that. But first, I press it. I don't wiggle my iron, I just press it down just to melt those little dots. Okay, then flipping it over, this is the time I can move my iron. And I'm pressing down pretty hard and wiggling my iron just so I can make sure it fuses. So here is the piece with the interfacing. Pretty standard, ready to go. Now the other piece, they again want stay stitching. Again, I'm going to stay tape from the point where there are notches all the way down. So instead of cutting it, I'm just gonna, I made a little mark with my pen, and I'm just going to iron my stay tape down there on both sides. All right, so I've got my stay tape done. There is a tremendous amount of stay stitching in this pattern. It's crazy, but anyhow, gonna go ahead and sew it. The stay stitching part goes on the outside edge. The inside edge is sewn onto, actually if I flip this way, it'll make more sense. Sewn onto here. So I'm going to go ahead and attach these two pieces. Okay, so moving on ahead, what we're going to be doing is sewing our two pieces together. Oops, almost did that wrong. Right sides together, matching up your shoulder seams and all that kind of stuff. Stitching it together along the inside edge. So first thing, I'm just stitching it regular 5/8 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now to be understitching, we're going to be, you open it up, and we're going to be pressing the seam allowance towards the interfaced side, okay? This is why you're going to need to make some notches, because this is not going to want to lay flat. So just wherever there's a curve, go ahead and make some little notches just to make your life easier now. I stay at least 1/8 of an inch away from my stitching line, my seam line, because I don't want that kind of trouble in my day. I'm having a good day. We don't need that. I got in my little notches all cut. So opening this back up with the, on the right side, my interfaced side, pushing the seam allowance down, and I am going to use the side of my, inside of my presser foot right here. See if I can point to it. This little edge right here as my seam guide. Oops, going okay. So I'm going to run that along my stitching line and just kind of pull out your interfacing side and stitch it all the way down. Okay, I don't know if you can see, I hope you can, but I have, here I'll put under this light, I have my understitching here, my understitching is right here, so that way when I fold it, it's going to naturally fold it inside. So say this is the outside edge that you see, you don't see that seam. It's going to be hidden nice and cleanly and safely on the inside of the garment. I have started to pin the band onto the shirt and just making sure that I match all the appropriate places to match. There are some places where it's stay stitched that you're going to need to clip just so that you can work it around the curve, and that's normal. So I just wanted to point that out. If you get to that point and it doesn't seem like it's fitting, you can clip it, it's okay. I also had to make some clips around the back of the neck on the fabric part, not on the facing, but actually on the back piece of the blouse. And again, that's okay. Just trying to make it so that everything 5/8 in will be flat, so you can sew it through. All right, so I have it sewn all the way around, and you can see it's going to be a nice little band. But now we need to finish it off on the inside. So here's what I'm seeing. Eventually, we're going to be slip stitching it closed, but I want to try to take some of the bulk out of here. Now, this part that is not have the interfacing on, I think is going to lay up there pretty smooth. But what I'm going to do is just trim it a little bit. I'm going to trim actually all my serged edge off, and so probably take it down to about 3/8 of an inch in here. So right now I'm going around and just trimming a 1/4 inch off of this facing all the way around. I think that that'll be a good place to start to take out some bulk and make it nicer for when I whip stitch down. Like everything that I'm going to be whip stitching, I like to pin it so that I can just barely see my stitching line. Okay, so I've got it pinned up. This is the right side, and this is the wrong side. So I'm going to go ahead now, my trusty thread, and slip stitch all the way around this whole edge. There is a pattern piece, number 11, that I just overlooked or threw away or something. It's a tiny, tiny little piece, but I think I can just go ahead and make one. What it is, it's a little rectangle that when you sew it, you place it over this bottom part.
Nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. They're gonna know. How would they know? How would they know? How would they know? I can't. Oh my god!
Well, I got that done. Now I'm going to go ahead and sew up the side seams, just matching them up. And the view that I'm doing has a little vent that's open, and there is a dot that we are only sewing up to. So where that dot is, I'm actually going to put here. Actually going to put 2 pins, because that's just the way that I remind myself when I'm sewing to stop, is when I see 2 straight pins. Okay, I've got the side seams done. I've pressed them open. This is my little vent down here. And even though the pattern doesn't call for doing the hem until the very last, I'm going to do that now before I put the sleeves on it, because I think that it'll be lighter and more easy to manage it that way. And also what I'm going to be doing on my vent is tucking my little serged edge under here. So it'll be like that, and then just a little narrow hem all the way around. I am marking where these 2 little dots are on this piece, because that's where we're going to be putting hook and eyes, because otherwise this will be very, very gappy here in the front. Alright, so here we are on sleeves. I gotta tell you, the longer I work on this pattern, the less I like it. And it's not like there's one particular thing that makes me feel this way, but every single part of it is complicated. It's like here they take a sleeve. It's a sleeve. Look, these are flat pieces, and yet they make it into 3 separate pieces. Every little piece of this pattern has some finagling to do on it. And after a while, it just seems to suck the joy out of the room. But maybe that's me. So I'm just going to carry on. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and make all my marks, my dots, my notches, especially these, because the view that I'm doing, these are the, you can't even see what I'm pointing at. These 2 dots here, that marks the opening. So it's leaving this little slit open on the view that I'm doing. Okay, so I have everything marked. I have little dots here. I have my notches cut. And what I'm going to do is sew these pieces together, this one up into this point. And but first I'm going to run it through my serger, all of the pieces, just so I can press everything down flat. Alright, so I got one sleeve all sewn together, and I went ahead and hemmed a little vent while I had it over there. But I just thought of something. I never actually measured the width of this sleeve. So giving myself a seam allowance over to here is not that much. It's 14 3/4. Now, yeah, that is bigger than my arm, but not by much. I have a chunky arm. My arm is 13.5 around, so it's going to give me enough space to move it, but it is in no way going to be as loose as this one. And if I had thought enough about it, I would have increased this center panel more. You know, on my pattern piece, I would have split it and opened it up. But I did not do that. I need to just walk away from this for a while and think, because if I'm going to do it, now is the time. But I think I need a glass of wine to think about that, so I'll be back later. Hello, I'm back. So, hold on a second. We need a heart-to-heart here. Okay. So literally, this blouse has sucked the joy out of my sewing room. I don't know why I'm not focusing here. And at this point, this sleeve, which was difficult to get an idea of how wide it was before I sewed all the pieces together, is just too narrow. Yeah, I can get it around my sausage arm, but barely, and that's going to pull every time I move my arm, and that's going to put all the work I put into the main body of the blouse for nothing. And as much as I want to say, just forget it, finish it out as it is, I can't, because it's not going to be wearable. And I really, really, after all of this effort, want a finished garment that I can wear. That's the goal. So, this centerpiece, as cut, is going to go. I'm going to take the seams out of the one that I just sewed together. This piece, I'm going to have to recut. This is the center sleeve piece. I'm going to have to recut it, and thankfully I have enough of this fabric left over. So I want to show you what I'm going to have to do here. So from this point, I'm going to fold it in half so that it is straight down. See, there's a line here. I can make sure that it is matching up. Then I'm going to go ahead and cut up this line. And I need to add, I shouldn't be using these scissors, but I'm in such a state I can't even deal with it. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm going to spread it out because I want, at this point, if I'm spreading it out, I want at least 2 inches at this point right here, because this here, right here, see that dot? That's where I need that space. So then, once I get it here, I'm going to need to adjust it so it goes back straight down. Okay? So I'm going to end up with a piece kind of like this. Putting these pieces back together again. Trying to salvage. What I'm going to do is put in my gathering stitches on the tops here. Then I'm going to do my side seams, and then I'm going to hem it. Before I put it onto my piece, I'm going to hem it. It'll be a lot easier maneuvering it that way. And the very last thing I'm going to do is actually set them in to the finished outfit, and that should be my last step. So I want to show you how I'm going to do my easing stitches. I actually did this once and I thought my camera was recording, but it wasn't, so I'm going to do it again. I set my stitch length just under a gathering stitch, so it's wide but it's not super wide. And I line up the edge of my presser foot with the edge of my fabric, so that's right there. I put my finger down. This is the same thing I do when I'm hemming a circle, by the way. I put this finger here down right behind my presser foot, and I push it down and close to the presser foot and start sewing. So that basically creates a very big accordion type pucker behind it. Let it go when it's too hard or too thick and start going again. Okay, so basically we're just easing between those two seams pretty much. But what that does is it gives you a nice little, very lightly gathered sleeve top so that your cap is all nice and curved and ready to set in, and you don't have to worry about a lot of gathering stitches to deal with. Just pressing this side seam open so it'll be nice and flat before I hem up the bottom. We're trying to look optimistically, you know. So now I have this long edge here, and I'm just going to make a very narrow hem, just literally a fold over and fold over, press it and top stitch it. Okay, I'm finally setting these sleeves in, so I am matching up all of my critical points, which are the bottom seam, the shoulder top matches with a dot, this seam matches with that seam, and the front one also, there's a little yoke seam that matches with a sleeve seam. Alright, I want to show you sewing in this sleeve. Even though we ease the top, cap, and things, there's still a few places where it's a little bit gapey, like right here and stuff. And I want to show you the way that I do it. I go ahead and pin and match up all the places that need to get matched. And I start at my underarm seam and do a little back and forth action there. Okay, now making sure that I don't sew something I'm not supposed to, I'm going to hold it so that my upper side, which is my body of the garment, is pretty tight, and that way the presser foot can ease in any issues that are in the bottom. I'm just making sure that nothing's folded in, so that way you don't have to stress a whole lot. So like here's the sleeve cap, and you can see where our little gathered part, well, maybe you can't. Our little gathered part, it's not quite gathered enough to be super tight, but if I stick my hand underneath here and just pull it so that it's level on the outside, all that hand under there is doing is keeping it from pooching out any. And hold the top taut, it's going to naturally ease in anything down here that needed to go. Let me turn that light back on here, see if we can do this. It's very tricky to get the camera to see what I see. So see here, my bottom is pooching out a little bit. My bottom's pooching out a little bit. I'm going to reach this hand underneath and pull it in, just so it's the right level. And with this hand, I'm holding this upper fabric tighter. Okay, and that way the presser foot eases it in. And keep going around and around. Almost done. Now when I get to the bottom where we started, I like to put an extra row of stitches 1/8 of an inch higher than the ones we started with, just to make sure that we have extra reinforcement so we don't split our underarm seam. So it is winter again. It's cold and damp. Love it. So here's my opinion on this pattern. The finished product, I think, is really pretty. The pattern itself is overcomplicated for the sake of being complicated. There's way too many pieces to make this an enjoyable, throw it together in an afternoon type of a pullover top. If you count the individual pieces, there's 24 individual pieces in here. 3 on each sleeve, 3 on each front, 3 on each back, 6 in the band, 6 in the yoke. It's crazy. It's crazy. And they're unnecessary, in my opinion, because nothing's cut on the bias, nothing is cut on a curve to like ease in fullness or anything. They're just straight. It's just adding seams for style purposes. And honestly, they blend in. When I'm looking at this in the mirror, I don't particularly see those seams popping out at me as a style option. So I haven't decided if I'm going to make it again, honestly. If I do, one, I'm adjusting these sleeves. When the pattern envelope doesn't give you a measurement for the finished sleeve width, and when you're cutting it out and you have all these individual pieces and you lay them next to each other, your eye tells you, oh, this sleeve is going to be perfectly wide because, you got all those seam allowances in there. And it wasn't until I put it together that I realized that this sleeve is crazy narrow. And I think I ran into this on that other McCalls pattern, the potato dress one. So I'm not going to throw the pattern away, but before I put it in my box, I am going to redraw the sleeve pattern so that it will fit my arm so I never run into this again. Style-wise, I think it's nice. I really think it's nice. I think it looks like an elegant, beachy, springy, walking through the shops on a Sunday morning type blouse. But honestly, it sucked all the joy out of my sewing room halfway through, and so I'm dealing with that. I think that if I didn't have that in the back of my mind, I would really love it. But since I have all of those frustrations of every single step of the way of this blouse became a chore, and it didn't have to be. That's the thing. It became a chore that wasn't necessary. They added difficulty just for the sake of adding difficulty, in my opinion. But I'm going to hang on to the pattern. We'll see in the future if I make it again. But for right now, I'm just going to have my coffee and try to enjoy the day with my pretty blouse on and forget all of its past history. This is like a bonus reel here. I am going to go ahead, before I put this pattern away, I'm going to create a new sleeve piece. So I wanted to show you the way that I do this. First thing I did was actually iron all of my sleeve pieces because I mangled them so much. And actually I had wadded them up into a ball during a fit of I am disgusted with you-ness. So I'm just going to tape the pattern back together the way it originally was. So I have my basis to start with. Now these pieces are sewn on, and they're sewn on for a 5/8 inch seam allowance. So when you overlap them, it should be 1.25 inch overlap. So that's what I am pushing it to. 1.25 down here. And 1.25 up there. I'm going to do that with the other side also. Now if you remember, this sleeve basically would just barely fit around my arm. I don't know why they insist on making sleeves so narrow. So what I need to do is add 2 inches up by this point where they have the little bullseye. At that point is where I need to add my 2 inches. Because every sleeve, even if it's a straight sleeve, you really need at least 2 inches of ease, or else you're not going to be able to move around comfortably. So, am I detached? Alright, so I have a separate pattern here. So I'm going to use the Sewing with Nancy, God bless her, pivot and slide method. Alright, got my stuff now. So the first thing you do is you have 2 markers, your tracing paper, and you trace around the pattern as is. I'm marking my little corners here, just as is. Now the place where I need to add my width, the length is fine, down here is fine, it's just up here, or right here. So I want to add 2 inches, so I'm going to add 1 inch to each side. So from my edge here, I'm going to mark where 1 inch is, and over here, I'm going to mark where 1 inch is. Okay? Now, I'm going to get my board. I have this big canvas that I got when they were like 60% off, and I just covered it with a big piece of fleece. It's my pivot and slide board. So I put this on here. Get my mangled pieces on here. I draw it on my flat table first because I don't want anything to bleed through onto here. That would just make me cry. So what you do is you get a stick pin and stick it in your little center circle, and the circle is on your sewing line, okay? And then you pivot the pattern until this line matches up with your 1 inch line that you're drawing, okay? And then I'm going to pivot it, well actually, then I take, this is with my secondary color, and draw along here, up. I'm going to mark my little notches there. Then I'm going to do it this way until this lines up with my 2 inch mark. Okay, so now I have those marks. Now I move this pen. So say this is over here. I'm going to stick this pen where that stitching line is, in that corner. And rock the pattern back so that this will taper down into my original cuff line down here. And I'm going to trace along there. And again, I should be using a straight edge, but when I cut it, I will go back when I cut it. And do the same thing over here. So here's my new corner. I put my pen 5/8 inch in both sides because that's my new stitching line. Turn this so it blends into the original down here. Here you go. Now, by adding an inch each side, it bumps it up. I'm going to go ahead and just make a little mark here where my bottom is. If I pull this off, go away. These two should be the same. 14 3/4 there and 14 3/4 there, which is the same as the original length. So what I'm going to do then is just put the line across here. So that's going to be my new cutting line. There. And now all I have to do is mark my little notches and things. So I want to keep this where it is. So what I'm going to do is mark this little hole, because that's the hole where the vent goes up to. And then I'm just going to draw a line straight down so I know that's my vent. And I will just slice it and make a continuous lap for that. Up here, this is where I have a single notch. And from there, if I rock at the very top here, that's where I have a circle. And I'm going to mark where my other little circle is going to be here. Another little circle is right about here. And that way I know where to gather that cap in. And that's my new sleeve. And this thing, it's gone. It is just so gone. It is like, ah. So, new sleeve. There you go. Bonus.